everybody, my name's Sam Kelly, and I'm here to talk about how you can unlock all 7 modes of the major scale by only practicing one scale. I know this might sound too good to be true for some of you, but stick with me here, and not only will I give you an approach to be able to unlock all 7 of these modes of the major scale, but also some real-world applications and how you can start using these modes in your own improvisation today. So what are modes, you might find yourself asking? Well, essentially, they are the different scales you get by starting and stopping on the other notes of the major scale other than the first note. Depending on which scale degree or note of the major scale you start on, you get a different sound or tonality. So these are the 7 different modes of the major scale. There is the Ionian mode, which is just the major scale. The Dorian mode. The Phrygian mode, Lydian mode, Mixolydian mode, the Aeolian mode, which is the natural minor scale, and the Locrian mode. Most people, when they first branch out from the major scale and start learning their modes, they kind of jump into things without much of a plan. See, the trap that I see people fall into time and time again with modes is they think that they need to learn each mode like it's its own separate scale that needs to be learned in a vacuum, separate from all the other modes or all the other scales. See, the first mode that we all learn without really even knowing it is the major scale. And if you practice this scale in the right way, you can recycle the technique that you develop by practicing this scale in all 12 keys. And the scale knowledge can also be recycled. And so what you're doing is you're paving the way to already kind of pre-learn each mode. Okay, let's take a moment and go all the way back here and talk about what even is a scale. Let's talk about what the building blocks of a scale are and how to construct our first major scale. To begin to answer this question, we need to first talk about intervals. Essentially, an interval is how we measure the distance from one note to the other. The 2 most basic intervals that we use when we're talking about scales and chords are whole steps and half steps. To better understand what a whole step or a half step is, let's take a look at the chromatic scale, which is all 12 notes that we use in our Western music system. So as you can see here, these are all 12 notes that we use in our Western music system. Remember, an interval is the measurement between 2 notes. So the distance here from A to B, we call a whole step. Half that distance, or a half step up from A, would be the distance from A to A sharp or B flat. Or we could go from A sharp or B flat up to B, and that would be another half step. So as you saw on that chromatic scale, there are notes that essentially have 2 names. A sharp and B flat, for instance, they're the same note. D sharp, E flat, they're also the same note. In the fancy music theory world, we call these enharmonic spellings, and depending on the context, you're either going to use one or the other. To further break down what a scale is, let's look at the DNA of what makes a major scale, or for the sake of this video, we're going to call it the Ionian mode. Like most other scales in the Western music system, the major scale is comprised of 7 notes, and it follows a series of whole steps and half steps. Starting from any note, the major scale follows this pattern: whole step, half step, whole step, whole step, whole step, and then one more half step, or whole, half, whole, half. So in addition to following this whole step, half step pattern, the other rule that we need to follow is that each major scale is to use all 7 letters of our musical alphabet once and only once. So let's bring our trusty chromatic scale back and construct a C major scale using this whole step, half step pattern. I'm assuming that you know the C major scale has no sharps or flats in its key signature, so this pattern should only utilize the natural notes, the notes that don't have a sharp or a flat next to them. Okay, C to D is a whole step, D to E is a whole step, E to F is a half step, F to G is a whole step, G to A is a whole step, A to B, another whole step, B to C brings us back with one more half step. And there we go. Like I said, all natural. C major, no sharps or flats. So let's do one more just so we can kind of see what happens when we have a scale that has either a sharp or a flat that ends up in it. Let's take a look at G major. A whole step up from G is A, whole step up from A is B, half step up from B is C, whole step from C is D, a whole step from D is E, a whole step from E is F sharp, and a half step up from F sharp brings us back to G. So remember that rule that I talked about briefly just a second ago, that all of our basic scales in our Western music system follow this rule of using all 7 letters of the musical alphabet once and only once. So like we see here in the key of G major, we get an F sharp instead of a G flat because we need to use all 7 of those letters. Now, we could go through all 12 notes of the chromatic scale and use this whole step, half step pattern to create all 12 keys of our major scale. Isn't that nice to know? Go ahead, pause this video, and I'll wait for you to write all those out. Go ahead and write them all out. Yeah, I wouldn't have done it either. Okay, let's keep going. Okay, so this is something I'm going to keep recommending throughout the rest of this video, and that is to practice your scales using some kind of backing track. So for this instance, we're talking about the major scale. So you can just simply go to YouTube and type in major scale backing track and put whatever key you're practicing in. So C major scale backing track, G major scale backing track. The other way you can do it is you can download an app like the TE Tuner. And this app is great because you can see how well in tune you are on your instrument, but it also has another feature where you can basically program in the notes that you want to play over. So go over to the sound tab and you can put in the notes of whatever you want it to play. So for this instance, the major scale, you're going to want to practice over either a major triad, so some kind of chord, either a major triad or a major 7 chord. So figuring out the notes that you need to use to practice any chord for any scale that you're working on, this is the simple, easiest way to think about it. All you have to do is take the first note of the scale, the third note of the scale, the fifth note of the scale, and if you want a little more richness, the 7th note of the scale, and combine them all to play at the same time using, for instance, like this TE Tuner app. Just click on over to the sound tab and then hit the sustain button and then play all these notes at the same time. So if you use the 1, 3, 5, and 7 of the C major scale, you're going to get a major 7 chord, which sounds really nice and full and rich. Also, make sure to use a metronome or some kind of drum backing track to help you really make sure you're playing everything in time as well. As we get to various modes, it might be appropriate to add certain extensions to these chords to really get the full sound of whatever mode we're playing in. This isn't completely necessary though, especially if you're just trying to get a little bit of harmonic context for things. So for now, just stick to the 1, 3, 5, and 7th notes of the scale and combine those to play over, or just stick to just Googling backing tracks. So what are modes? Okay, imagine a musical playground where all 7 of these notes hang out. They all have different personalities, different moods, different sounds, and all of these notes can be combined together to make up what we call the major scale. But just kind of like a play or a movie, each one of these different characters, if you will, can take on the lead role at different times. And that's where we get the different modes, essentially, is when one of these notes becomes the main character of a certain scene. As we go through each one of these modes, we're going to be looking at them from kind of 2 different perspectives. And so let's talk about what these are. We're going to call the relationship between the mode and the major scale that it shares its key center with, we're going to call that a relative relationship. So just kind of like you share the DNA with your parents, these scales are going to share the same notes or a key signature. The other way we're going to look at it is we're going to relate each mode back to its parallel major scale. So for instance, we're going to talk about D Dorian, and we're going to say, well, how is this different from D major? What notes need to be changed? And so that'll give us a little more perspective on the notes that are being lowered to give us that sound that is different from the major scale. To recap again, we're going to be talking about its relative relationship as well as its parallel relationship. Let's shift our focus now over to the 2nd scale degree, or the 2nd mode, which is the Dorian Mode. This is a minor scale, and it's very similar to the natural minor scale that we're going to talk about here shortly, which is the Aeolian mode. But the main distinct difference between these two scales is the sixth scale degree. Here is the 1 octave D Dorian scale, which is relative to C major as they share the same key signature of no sharps or flats. And now if we compare this to its parallel major scale of D major, we can see what notes give this scale its Dorian minor sound. As you can see from the scale degree numbers with flat symbols next to them, to turn this from a D major scale to a D Dorian scale, we have to lower the 3rd and the 7th scale degrees by 1/2 step. As we will see later on with the Aeolian mode or natural minor scale, the Dorian mode has what we call a major 6th scale degree, compared to the natural minor or Aeolian mode's lowered or minor 6th scale degree. Okay, I can't stress this enough. Make sure to practice every single one of these modes with some kind of harmonic context. So in this case, you're going to want to practice with a minor 7 chord. Like I said earlier when we were talking about the major scale, you're going to just take the 1st, 3rd, 5th, and 7th notes from this scale, combine them together to make a minor 7 chord. So for this case of D Dorian, D minor, D Dorian minor, you're going to use the notes D, F, A, and C. So remember these extensions I was talking about? If you want to add one note, which we'll call an extension, to really get this Dorian minor sound, add to your chord the 6th note, but an octave higher than any of the other notes that you're putting into your chord. And so this 6th note, which in this case of D Dorian, is going to be the note B. And that will help give you just a little bit more of a Dorian sound with this chord, but just using the basic minor 7 chord is going to work just fine as well. Let's shift our focus over to the 3rd mode of the major scale, which is the Phrygian mode. At its core, this is a minor scale, but as you can see, it is a bit of a departure from the Dorian minor scale. Comparing E Phrygian to its parallel major scale of E major, we can see that not only have we lowered the 3rd, 6th, and 7th notes by a 1/2 step, but we have also lowered the 2nd scale degree, which really gives this scale its unique sound. Okay, so let's talk about practicing the Phrygian scale. Once again, make sure you're practicing all these scales the full range of your horn. So all the way up to your high F or F sharp, depending on the scale, all the way down to your low B or B flat, depending on the scale. And to get the most out of the harmonic context of this Phrygian scale, you can basically just practice over a minor 7 chord. So in the case of E Phrygian, like we're talking about here, you're going to want to use the notes E, G, B, and D. And that's going to give you a nice basic sound to practice the scale, and really make sure you're focusing on that 2nd scale degree, which is going to give you the most Phrygian kind of understanding that you can get from this scale. If you want to add any of these extensions that we've been talking about, the best extension here is to add that 2nd scale degree. And so in this case, we're going to call it a 9. So anytime you're adding an extension, we use the number that it would kind of be if we kept playing past the 1st note of the scale. So, we started on E, and that's note number 1, but when we get up to E again, we're going to call that the 8th note. And then when we get to the 2nd note, we call that the 9th note. So add the 9 to this chord. So you would do E, G, B, and D, and F natural. And that's going to really give you kind of a crunchy sounding chord, but it'll sound cool. And it'll also kind of help give you that kind of Phrygian sound when you're practicing this scale. All right, let's shift our focus now to the 4th mode of the major scale, the Lydian mode. Distinct difference between the Lydian mode and any major scale, and that is the 4th scale degree is raised by 1/2 step. If we compare the F Lydian scale to the F major scale, we can see F major has B flat on its 4th scale degree, and the F Lydian scale has a B natural. To really get the most out of this sound, practice over a major 7 chord. So for F Lydian, we're going to use an F major 7 chord with the notes F, A, C, and E. Once again, you can add an extension to this chord, and that extension, you're right, is the 4th scale degree. We're going to call this also the 11. So once again, we were calling the second scale degree from the Phrygian scale a 9, or a flat 9 for the Phrygian scale. We're going to call this a sharp 11. So add the sharp 11 to this chord to really get a Lydian sound. All right, guys, so we're going to move our focus over to the 5th mode of the major scale, which is the Mixolydian Mode. If we look at G Mixolydian and compare it to its parallel major scale of G major, we can kind of get an understanding of how it's different from a major scale. As we can see here, the F sharp from G major is lowered by 1/2 step to get us a G Mixolydian scale. So for any major scale, lower the 7th scale degree by 1/2 step, voila, you have a Mixolydian scale. So the chord that we're going to associate a Mixolydian scale with is a dominant chord. And for the purposes of this video, playing a Mixolydian scale over a dominant chord is going to sound just fine. Yes, there's people in the comments I know right now saying, but there's so many hipper things and cooler things to play over a dominant chord. Yes, this is so true. But for the purposes of this, Mixolydian scales over dominant chords sound just fine. Of course, there's different contexts, different extensions, blah, blah, blah. I know. So to get our G dominant chord, once again, we're going to use the 1, 3, 5, and 7 of this scale. And that's going to give us G, B, D, and F, which is the G dominant chord. And that's what we're going to use to practice our Mixolydian scales over. So this brings us to the 6th mode of the major scale, the Aeolian Mode, or as it's more commonly referred to as the natural minor scale. This is kind of the second scale I feel like everybody learns, and it's often referred to as the relative minor scale. For some reason, this is pretty much the only scale you're going to hear referred to as the relative minor scale. So more times than not, people are going to be talking about the Aeolian mode when they say relative minor. If we compare the Aeolian mode to its parallel major scale, we see that it has a lowered 3rd, 6th, and 7th scale degree. Playing this scale over a minor 7 chord will really give you some context into how this tonality sounds. With A Aeolian, you will play over an A minor 7 chord, which contains the notes A, C, E, and G. So you can add the extension of a flat 13 into this minor 7 chord, and that will really kind of help send home the natural minor sound, but it's not necessary when you're practicing. So I really recommend comparing this scale to the Dorian scale. This is really crucial because in most contexts, when you're sitting in with a band, they're going to tell you, hey, we're playing in this minor key. But more times than not, they're not really going to differentiate between whether or not they're playing in a natural minor sound or an Aeolian mode sound or a Dorian sound. And it's up to you as the performer or as the soloist to kind of figure this out on your own. So when you're comparing these two scales, like I said earlier, you're going to really want to focus on that 6th scale degree. And that's either going to give you that major 6th sound with this minor scale, which will wield a Dorian scale, or that minor 6th sound, which is going to give you this natural minor sound. So what I would do is I would put on a backing track with just this minor 7 chord. So just make sure you're only using the 1, 3, 5, and 7, and go back and forth between playing a natural minor scale with that flat 6 or a Dorian scale with that major 6. And that's going to really help you kind of get these two sounds in your ear. And that brings us to the final mode of the major scale, which is the Locrian Mode. This is a really kind of like crunchy, dissonant scale, but it's really cool to use over chords like the half diminished chord. So let's dive in and see what this is all about. So how this scale differs from its parallel major scale of B major in this instance is it has a lowered 2nd, 3rd, 5th, 6th, and 7th scale degree. So basically everything but the 4th scale degree is lowered by a half step here. So if you stack thirds off of the 7th scale degree here of the C major scale, you're going to get a B half diminished chord. So the notes you need for this chord are B, D, F, and A. Half diminished chords are used quite frequently in the jazz vocabulary, but you will see them in pop and rock and funk realms as well. So this is a good one to practice up on. I know that was a lot of information. So let's organize these modes into two different camps. The major scale camps, so the modes that have major thirds in them, and the minor scale camps, so the modes that have minor thirds in them. On the major side of things, we have, of course, the Ionian mode, which is the major scale, the Lydian mode, and the Mixolydian mode. On the minor side, we have the Dorian, Phrygian, Aeolian, and Locrian modes. So this will help you be able to associate these modes with their corresponding chord types a lot faster. As you can see, there are only 3 modes with a major third that are in the major scale camp. Anytime you see a chord that has a major triad, you will know right off the bat that you will be dealing with one of these 3 scales. The rest of the modes are in the minor camp. Same rules apply. Anytime you see a chord with a minor symbol, so like this little minus symbol here, or the abbreviation of MIN for minor, you'll know that you're going to be dealing with probably one of these scales, one of these modes. Notice that there is an asterisk next to the Locrian scale. It is in the minor list because it has a minor third, but it is important to take note that the chord symbol that it will mostly be associated with can kind of be confusing at first to understand, as most of the time the chord is written like this. You'll see a capitalized letter, so down here, and then there's going to be a little circle with a slash drawn through it up here, where normally you would just see like a 7 or some kind of extension. The longer form version would be B minor 7 flat 5 in the case of our B Locrian scale and B half diminished scale or chord, and you will see this chord symbol out in the wild for sure. You'll see a minor 7 flat 5 and you'll think, okay, Locrian scale, half diminished. All right. Jazz musicians can be a little bit lazy when it comes to writing things out, so you will see the confusing circle with the slash through it more times than not. Like a C minor 7 chord, this chord has both the minor third, which is half step lowered from the major third that you'll see, and the minor 7, but it goes one step further and also lowers the 5th, making the chord formula look like this: a 1, flat 3, flat 5, flat 7. So this is comparing it to a major 7 chord, where we lower the 3rd, the 5th, and the 7th by 1/2 step. Let me preface this next section with, you should learn all your modes. You should understand what chords to use them over and realize that you probably will see them all in a improvisatory setting at some point in your life, especially if you're playing jazz music. But with that said, if you're brand new to modes and you're thinking, man, there's so much information here, where do I even start? These are the 4 modes that I would really focus on. That will probably, get you down the road quite a ways, to be honest. So these 4 modes are, of course, your Ionian mode, which is the major scale. If you do not have the ability to play your major scale on all 12 keys, this is where you start. The next one would be your natural minor scale, which is the Aeolian mode. Everybody's usual progression is to go from the major scale to the natural minor scale. And then I would say practice your Mixolydian scale. Mixolydian scale is pretty similar, as we've discussed, to the major scale. So it's not too much harder to practice the Mixolydian scale once you have your major scales down. And then, of course, your Dorian scale. The Dorian scale, like I really stressed when we were talking about the natural minor scale, is something that gets used almost as much as the natural minor kind of tonality in a live performance setting, especially when you're playing funk, soul, and some rock music as well, and different jazz tunes, of course. So these are the 4 scales that I would practice: your major or Ionian mode, your natural minor scale or Aeolian mode, your Mixolydian and Dorian minor scales. Those 4 are going to get you a very long way into your improv music career. All right, well, I think I'd be doing us a little bit of a disservice if I didn't address the notion of practicing our arpeggios and just like talking about chords that can be found in the major scale / all of the modes. So just kind of like how we've been talking about how to really practice our major scale in a way that is, we can recycle that information and that technique to learn all of the rest of our modes a little easier. It's a similar concept when it comes to the chords found within the major scale and how we can apply those to these different modes and tonalities. So let's talk about just if we were to build a chord off of each scale degree of the major scale, what kind of chord would we get? On the first scale degree, we would get a major 7 chord. So we're just talking about just some basic, just 7 chords here. We're not going to add any extensions. So the first scale degree would be a major 7 chord. Scale degree number 2, we get a minor 7 chord. Scale degree 3, another minor 7 chord. Scale degree 4, we're going to have a major 7 chord. Scale degree 5, we would make a dominant chord, a major triad with a lowered 7, flat 7. Scale degree 6, we get another minor 7 chord. And then our 7th scale degree, we get that half diminished chord, or it would be a minor 7 flat 5 chord, would be the other kind of way to talk about it. That is our formula. Those are the chords. That doesn't matter if you're playing C major or F sharp major. You can get that quality of chord built on each one of those scale degrees. All you have to do, the only thing that changes are the notes, but the tonality, whether it's a major 7 or a minor 7 chord or a dominant chord, those are the types of chords built off of each one of those scale degrees. Those are the chords. If we switch over to, let's say, A minor, or just our Aeolian mode, what is the one chord changes. So the Aeolian mode is built off of the 6th scale degree, right? As we've learned. Now the new 1 chord is that minor 7 chord built off of that scale degree. Our 2 chord is what used to be our 7 chord, which is this half diminished chord. Our 3 chord is what used to be the 1 chord, which is this major 7 chord, and so on. You can see how we've reorganized it here. And so if we go to our Mixolydian mode, now the 1 chord is this dominant chord, and the 2 chord is what used to be the 6 chord, which is this minor 7 chord. The types of chords don't change, just what we label as the 1 chord and the 2 chord does. The order of the chords change. So don't stop practicing your arpeggios when you start practicing your modes. When you practice them and you really get them down under your fingers with the major scale, when you go to practice them with your other modes, you think of these same chords kind of in a different way, in a different context. But by practicing them in these different contexts, they're going to get even further kind of ingrained in your fingers and your ability to play them. So always, always, always practice your arpeggios when you're practicing these different scales, and you're going to see your playing skyrocket, I swear. So let's take this kind of chord scale degree talk one step further. So this is a practical application. So you've probably heard this quite a few times. Maybe you're sitting in the crowd and you hear the band talking about, the song before they play it, or maybe you've even experienced this on stage. The band will talk about the chord progression in one of two ways, if they're going to tell you the chord progression at all. First, they're going to say, hey, what key we're playing in. The next thing they're going to maybe tell you is the chord progression. So when you go to solo, you know what chords you're playing over. So they might say, hey, this is in the key of A minor, and we're going to go from A minor, we're going to go up to the C major chord, and then we're going to go up to the D minor chord, and we're going to come back down to A minor. That's one way they might say it. The other way is they're going to say, hey, this is in the key of A minor, and it's going to be a 1, 4, 5 progression, or a 1, 6, 2, 5, 1 progression. Or they might say this is A minor and it's a blues. That'd be maybe the third way they would talk about it. So that's where these numbers come from. So they're going to give you the key. That's going to be your 1 chord, A minor. Okay. A minor, if it's natural minor, we got the 6th scale degree of the major scale as our 1 chord, that A minor 7 chord. And now those subsequent numbers are going to be the chords built off of that scale degree. So I've been talking a lot about different keys and practicing these scales in all 12 different keys. And if this is totally foreign, you're thinking this is a daunting task, how are you going to remember the key signatures for 12 different scales? This is, in my honest, humble opinion, the best way for you to start organizing your scales in a way that you're going to be able to both memorize them and recall them in a real world situation. Cue the circle of fifths. So depending on how you look at this circle, we call it the circle of fifths because as you go around the circle clockwise, each note, and so remember our interval talk from earlier, is a fifth away from each other. So C to G, for instance, from 0 or 12 o'clock to 1 o'clock, we have C, which is 1, D is 2, E, F, and G. So they're 5 notes away from each other. And same thing, G to D, so G, A, B, C, and D. That's 5 notes. But then you can also think of it as the circle of fourths. So if you go around the circle counterclockwise, C to F is a fourth away. So C, D, E, and F, and then so on, right? So F to B flat would also be a fourth. So you can kind of think of it as 2 ways. We're going to kind of use both directions actually to talk about the best way I think to start utilizing this circle. At its most basic function, it's a great tool for helping you remember how many sharps or flats are in each key. At 12 o'clock, we have C major, which has 0 sharps. As we go clockwise around the circle, we have all of our sharp keys in order of how many sharps are in each key. At 1 o'clock, we have G major with 1 sharp. 2 o'clock, we have D major with 2 sharps, and so on, until you get down to C sharp major, which has all 7 notes in its scale with a sharp next to it. If we go around the circle counterclockwise, we have our flat keys with F at 11 o'clock with 1 flat, B flat with 2 flats, and so on until you get to D flat, which is the flat version of C sharp major, but it only has 5 flats. So most people think of D flat being the easier way to think of this key area. Okay, so you can even use this circle to remember your order of sharps and flats. So think of it as, the order in which they appear in these different scales. So let's talk about the flat side for a minute. F major has 1 flat, and that's B flat. The next key on this side of the circle, if we go to the key of B flat major, which has 2 flats, the 2 flats in this key are B flat and E flat. So we can see here, B flat, E flat. So this is where our order of sharps are. You're trying to recall the key of E flat major, and you're thinking, I have 3 flats. So what you would do is you would go, okay, we would have B flat, E flat, and A flat. All right here, this is the order of flats. Let's do one more. If we are playing in the key of A flat major, you're going to be thinking, I have 4 flats. 1, 2, 3, 4 here. The flats that are going to be A flat, if we follow our order of flats here, are going to be B flat, E flat, A flat, and D flat. So that is where we find our order of flats. So let's go to the sharp side of the circle here. We're going to be working clockwise now. Our first scale that has 1 sharp is G major, and its 1 sharp is F sharp. Our order of sharps starts here. What we were calling F major on this circle is now going to be our first sharp. So this is going to help us remember all the different sharps we have in our keys. The next scale, D major, has 2 sharps, which those 2 sharps are F sharp and C sharp. A major has 3 sharps, which is F sharp, C sharp, and G sharp. As we can see, perfectly outlined on the circle here, F, C, and G, or F sharp, C sharp, and G sharp. If you've been watching everything up to this point, thank you for sticking with me. I'm hoping you're getting really good value out of this video. If you just jumped to this section because you saw this as the cheat code section, I don't really blame you. But I do encourage you to go back and kind of rewatch everything I've talked to up to this point, because it is going to be relevant to what I'm about to say. Okay, with that said, drumroll please, here is the cheat code. It's practicing your major scale, the full range of your instrument. Okay, I know this sounds a little too simple to be true here, but this is the cheat code, and here's why. When you practice your major scales, and do this in all 12 keys, by the way, the full range of your instrument, you're unlocking the technical ability to play in each one of these key centers freely. Since the major scale is the first scale that we all learned, this is the best one, I think, to do this with. So, like we said, modes are essentially just the scales we get when we pick a different note of the major scale as our starting note. And so, whenever we practice these scales the full range of our instruments, we're essentially unlocking the ability to play all these modes at the same time. Let's take a look at a visual representation of all the notes of the C major scale within the natural range of the saxophone. If you're playing just a 1 octave C major scale, you could play up this group of notes and come back down. Then, if you were to follow a pretty common route and learn your relative A minor scale, or the Aeolian mode, you would learn this scale here and play up this group of notes, and then come back down. Though you might recognize some similarities between these two scales, like they both don't have any sharps or flats, in your brain, I think you're still going to think of them as 2 different worlds, 2 different scales, and you're not really going to be making a lot of connections because you're not practicing either one of these the full range of your instrument. So, for instance, when you practice your C major scale, the full range of your saxophone, clarinet, trumpet, whatever, you are going to be unlocking the technical ability to take the notes that you're practicing and repurpose them, recycle them for the different modes that you're going to then be learning. For instance, when you start on your low C on saxophone, go all the way up to your high F, come all the way back down to your low B, and end on that original C that you started on, it's going to be not any more difficult, really, to then go to your natural minor scale and start on the note A, and then do the same thing. Start on A, go all the way up to your high F, all the way down to your low B, and then end back up on the original A that you started on. So for instance, let's take this to the Mixolydian scale. For C major, it's going to be G Mixolydian, and now we're just going to be starting on a note lower than on the A minor scale that we just played. So we're going to start on G this time and do the same thing, all the way up to F, all the way down to low B, back to our original note of G. The more you do this in these different keys that you're practicing, the more you're going to understand and be able to play within these different key centers with a greater ease. So we've addressed the technical ability part of this whole problem, this whole scenario. And the thing that we need to be working on at the same time is getting these scales in our ear. And I've mentioned it over and over again when we're talking about all the modes, and that's just playing along with a backing track. What gets lost when we're practicing all of these scales, the full range of our instrument, say if we're doing it without any harmonic context, it's just going to feel like we're playing the same scale over and over again. And from a technical point of view, that's a really good thing because our fingers are going to be getting better and better at doing this same task over and over again. But for our ears and for our understanding of how to use these modes, if we're not using a harmonic context, then we're not getting anything out of this practicing other than just having our fingers, playing over different groups of notes. So whenever you're playing a different mode, always make sure to be using the appropriate backing track or the appropriate chord that I've mentioned in the previous sections of this video to really tune and train your ear to recognize these different modes. Without that, there's no point in practicing your modes because it's just going to feel like you're starting on a different note of the major scale, which is, like I said, great for the technique, not good for the ear. So how can we start using some of these modes out in the wild in your improvisation, looking at like different jazz progressions or chords? It's pretty simple. Anytime you see like just a major triad, so just like a capital letter by itself as a chord symbol, you're going to be using the Ionian mode or the major scale. For the Mixolydian scale or mode, for instance, anytime you see a dominant chord, you can use a Mixolydian mode as long as it doesn't have an extension next to it. A dominant chord and a Mixolydian scale going to work just great. When it comes to our minor scales, it's all about the context of where the chord is sitting within the chord progression. If the chord is acting as a 6 chord, you're going to be using the natural minor scale or the Aeolian mode. If it's acting like a 2 chord, like as in, the most popular chord progression in jazz, the 2-5-1, you're going to be using a Dorian scale over that too. So for more chord examples for each one of these modes, refer to the PDF document I have linked in the description below. This document can be used kind of in reference for this whole video. And so go to the chord scale relationship section of this PDF document, and you're going to get more chord symbols and more suggestions for chords, for where you're going to be able to use some of these modes. So what are some takeaways that I hope you get from this video? The main one, as you can probably guess, is the power of practicing your major scale, the full range of your instrument. And then doing this in all 12 keys will help you unlock the ability to play all of your modes. Number 2, harmonic context is everything when it comes to these modes and scales. So making sure that you practice everything with some kind of backing track or with the appropriate scale or chord that you need to really hear the tonality and the sound you get with each one of these modes. The other thing is make sure to always practice with a metronome or some kind of drum track. The main point is recycling this information. It's recycling information, repurposing things that you've worked on and being able to apply it to different concepts. So when you do practice the major scale, the full range of your instrument, you can recycle that information to be able to unlock all of your modes. So it's this concept of recycling information, and you can do that with more than just modes and these different scales here. So in all aspects of your playing, think about ways you can be recycling whatever you're practicing to unlock different areas of your playing. So if you're interested in exploring this journey of saxophone a little bit more and think that maybe some personalized mentoring will really help you get over whatever plateau or wall that you are experiencing, I do offer one-on-one mentoring. Maybe you are, you've been clicking around watching these YouTube videos, you've been downloading PDF documents from well-known saxophone players hoping to find that nugget of truth that'll unlock the keys of the kingdom for you, or maybe you've done some video lesson series as well, and just the learning things on your own kind of thing hasn't worked out very well. I've been developing this course that will deliver all of the music theory knowledge that you'll need to be a successful performing musician and have the ability to sit in with just about any band in a live setting. This course is quick. It's a 12 to 16 week course that aims to give you all the tools you need to be able to sit in with a band. I've put a lot of effort into making sure that it is easily understandable. It's in very coherent chunks that all go from one section of the course into the other, and essentially leave you with a really easy to follow step-by-step course that hopefully transform you from being a somewhat novice musician into a confident performer that is both excited to play with other musicians, but a knowledgeable part of the group. Don't just take my word for it here. This is Chuck. He's been a student of mine for a while now, and above all that, he's been a really good friend of mine over the years. Here is his take on his experience in the course and some thoughts that he has for you if you're thinking about joining my program. So what do you do for a living, first of all?
I'm a CPA, managing partner of a CPA firm here in Durango, Colorado.
We've been at it for, like we were saying, a few months now. Is there anything in particular you feel like you've made like a breakthrough on? Is there like been any aha moments you've maybe experienced from kind of some of the stuff we've been going over?
I think being able to maybe understand better the relationships between different chords, the relationships between different modes. I have a pretty mathematical mind. A lot of times when I've listened to people talk about it, they talk about it in a way that doesn't make sense to me. And so I sit there and nod my head and really don't understand. And whereas I feel like with this, not only am I practicing certain things and you and I talking about things, but I can also stop and go, whoa, Sam, are you saying blah, 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 or how does this relate to this? That has been really, I would say some of the aha moments for me is I get a thought rolling around in my head and I can actually ask somebody and have them explain to me why my thinking's right or why it's maybe a little wrong. It's the other key for me is just being able to ask questions and not just sit and listen and think you're going to absorb it.
Have you done any of the other like video lesson series that some other saxophonists have put out there, or
no, I've just listened to some of the podcasts, watched some of the YouTubes, but I didn't do any of the for pay deals. One of the pitfalls is that I think our brains think, oh, there's some trick I'm missing here. And so if I just and it's same with golf as it is with music. You think, oh, if I watch this guy, I'm going to figure this out. Mm-hmm. And in general, no. You might learn a little bit, and there might be some useful things, but all of those fundamentals are so important.
If you see a link down in the description still below, that means that I still have room in my studio to take on new students. If you click this link, it'll take you to a form that you'll fill out, and it'll essentially walk you through setting up a one-on-one first lesson with me where I'll outline everything that we will be doing in this course. Either you can take the material and kind of work on some of this stuff on your own for a bit, or we can essentially start working together immediately. Usually I try to schedule our first actual lesson for the course the same week that we sign up for our first kind of meeting. So within the next 2 or 3 days, we'll have our first lesson. This whole course will be directly with me. It'll be one-on-one. We will meet at least once every week for a minimum of 1 hour, and I will be walking you through every step of the way. This isn't a group lesson. This isn't going to be you kind of meeting with me, but also following some videos. This is going to be 100% my course, catered to you every week. So depending on how you are interacting with the course material, we'll tweak things, we'll come up with solutions. If you're a busy professional, we'll find a way to make this work for you. Now, just to kind of end this video a little bit, feel free to play along. Let's jam in the key of D, Dorian, for a minute.